Today, we invited, Professor Adam Hescott, Associate Professor of East Asian History of University of Leeds. He is a very well-known scholar, who is working on border politics, mainly North Korea and China, China and North Korea, and then, of course, in Vietnam and Mongolia and other, Asian countries. Okay, Professor Hescott, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Professor Peck. I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm looking forward to your questions and the kind of productive discussion around this very interesting topic, which I was asked to speak to. The title of the presentation is meant to provoke just slightly because, of course, we have legal and illegal trade happening at the same time. And this concept of porousness or exchange is one where is really the question is open. How open is the border for both legal and illegal trade? And then, of course, what impact does that have within North Korea? And how do the Chinese side police this? And kind of to what extent is China enabling or preventing more illegal trade or smuggling in particular into North Korea? So I'll start my slides here. Just a few resources. This is my most recent book, co-edited with colleagues at Leiden University, and Christopher Green is a well-known translator and scholar of North Korea. And he was previously at Daly K, then he went to Cambridge University. He's now an assistant professor at Leiden University and previously worked with International Crisis Group. So Stephen Denny, a political scientist. And the work, which I will refer to at probably near the very end, is just listed here at the bottom, how authoritarian regimes maintain domain consensus, kind of thinking a little bit about and trying to problematize this slightly binary opposition we tend to have between markets and authoritarian regimes or Leninist party states like North Korea. So trying to think about what are ways in which the regime is co-opting some of those ostensibly anti-regime or potentially problematic, both ideologically and logistically, elements like Donju or marketized individuals, right? Individuals benefiting. And of course, North Korean quote-unquote reform looks very different than China, and also their type of anti-corruption and definitions of corruption. So those are some ideas which I wish to look at in this presentation. I also am the editor of the sinonk.com website, which has a good archive and continues to look at interactions between the two. And Professor Peck mentioned Mongolia. Some of our writers on that site are looking at kind of Korea-Mongolia ties and trying to broaden out a little bit this North Korean relationship, including with Russia. But we don't want to get too fixated on Russia, and I won't be mentioning much about it today. Okay, so Chinese smuggled goods in North Korean markets. Of course, this deals at the local level in North Korea with at the gun level or county level, and we discuss domestic controls and the role of small trade. That, of course, operates under the umbrella of larger scale legal trade between the two states, and in some sense is dependent upon decent relations, a good working relationship between the Korean Workers' Party, Nodongdang, and the Chinese Communist Party, or Zhongguo Gongchandang. So this kind of and the policing of illegal trade is also dependent on those interactions. So the kind of the image, by the way, in the lower left of your screen is of gun officials in county level officials in Pyongyang who came to be instructed by the leader Kim Jong-un in April 2021. And of course, in the upper left there is the very famous bridge, which is not really a bridge anymore, between Dandong and Sinŭiju. The effectiveness of controls in the border region, this is a short presentation, so I am not going to necessarily be drawing massive distinctions between Yanbian, the Korean Autonomous Prefecture, or Dandong and Liaoning, but there are differences and there are important differences. So I'm going to kind of touch on that just ever so slightly, the gradations of change. To focus on the Chinese side first, and most significantly, you have the Public Security Bureau. These are some images which I took a few years ago In Yenji, in the upper left, Tumen, which is, of course, an important hub, much smaller than Dandong, but an important cross-border trade that right across from Onsun County in Hamgyongbukdo or North Hamgyong province. But in some sense, this image in the lower left indicates, in a sense, kind of how fragmentary or how kind of residual sometimes these border controls are. This is an advertisement for a two-man city public security bureau aid station or a working group kind of to patrol the border. And it's rather faded. And in fact, some of the infrastructure there is in flux, right? This question of kind of how strong and how strenuous are the border controls. And of course, the floods recently, which I will touch upon in North Pyongan province, wash a lot of that away. So this notion of kind of like we see, and I'll just hold up a newspaper here. This is a German newspaper, Die Zeit, which is a weekly newspaper. And this is a big, long report. And Stadt zieht die Mauern hoch. It's all about North Korea putting up the walls. And this is a newspaper saying that basically nobody's moving across the border. The infrastructure is amazing. They've built all this up during the pandemic, and there's very little illegal moving back and forth. But I think looking at the local level, that can never fully be the case. And in fact, this border infrastructure requires logistics and supply and continuous reinforcement, etc. And that's a big investment for North Korea. And even on the Chinese side, I think that it's all dependent on people, right? And these officials. So let's look at one just case study here, right? Chinese provincial PSB leadership. This is Public Security Bureau, otherwise known as Gong Anju. This is Wen Jingchun, otherwise known as Mun Kyung-jun, who is an ethnic Korean who is the head of Public Security Bureau in Yenji City for the last 3 years. So a rather significant person. He's ethnic Korean, as I mentioned. He's born in Hulong, so he's been involved at the local level with public security work since the mid-1990s. So this is a person who he's also fairly well educated, a degree in Korean translation. This is not something you often see with Chinese police who, so it's not simply that his ethnicity is Korean. He's vested in kind of in interpretation. But he's a person who's been dealing with cross-border crime in terms of Haeryong and the Musan city, rather, on the North Korean side for a very long time. And so he is certainly familiar he's been familiar particularly on economic crime. So this is a person with a focus in the mid-2000s, so the mid-2010s rather. So kind of, this is hard to read. Is this sort of all anti-corruption? Is he disrupting trade networks with North Korea? But there is certainly an interplay here. And it's these type of people who have risen in the Xi Jinping bureaucracy who can kind of speak the language of anti-corruption and talk about disrupting illegality. Obviously, these are things that any police officer or police administrator would do well to emphasize, but have been particularly successful in the Xi Jinping era in terms of their rise. It's interesting that his predecessor, also an ethnic Korean, Kim Kyung-il, was charged with crimes in his exact same job, head of Public Security Bureau in Yenji City, not the entire prefecture. So you've got an ethnic Korean in place there. He was charged with crimes of corruption in 2019, and as far as I know, is in prison at the moment. So it's, they put people in these important jobs, but those people are also often themselves involved in corruption. Incidentally, just as an aside, his boss, the head of Public Security Bureau for the entire Yanbian Korean Autonomous Prefecture, is of course an ethnic Chinese, Duan Yujian. So anyway, interesting case study here. Just this is publicly available data. We can at least get some sense of who is enforcing these policies, what kind of background do they have, to what extent would they be aware of and engage with and understanding these local smuggling or corruption networks. Illicit commodities and trade. Again, on the Chinese side of the border, we can see, and this is true in North Korea too, a longer term and perpetual struggle between state imperatives and local producers or local traders. So the image you see here is illegally produced tobacco, 36 tons of it confiscated, presumably burned, in Wangqing, which is, of course, one of the most ethnically Korean counties on the side. It doesn't directly abut the DPRK or North Korea, but it's very important, and it's kind of this hinterland, so to speak, of the Yen's prefecture. It gets less attention than a place like Hunchun or Ta because it's not right on the river, nor is it particularly economically modernized to those areas. But there is also an anti-narcotics crackdown not in the Yanbian Korean area. And in fact, Mr. Moon, who we just saw in the previous slide, was just last month at a kind of an anti-drug day NGO, sort of trying to get more talking about local addicts and prevention of drug networks, illegal drug networks. We see more of that sort of thing in Dandong, where the illicit commodities. So let me speak to that for a moment. In fact, I'm going to just back up to this slide of looking at the bridge in Dandong, since what I'm saying is about Dandong now. I think we have to consider, obviously, some of these classic examples of illegal commodities, commodities that are illegal on both sides. We're not talking about somebody moving rice, for example, as we saw like in Unsun County not too long ago, where you have local cadre in the Workers' Party who are kind of slapped on the wrist or arrested or criticized for illegal importing of rice during the pandemic, for example. We're talking about illegal commodities moving across the border, like narcotics, like sanctioned goods as well, certain types of metals moving across the border. So I think in this context that I've raised, kind of anti-corruption in China, I think it's important not to consider anti-corruption just a one-way ratchet. It isn't that Xi Jinping continues to press for anti-corruption measures and therefore he continues to clean up, or that there is no way for illegal activity to come back. So what do I mean here on the structural level? If we look at recent reporting from RFA, Radio Free Asia Korean, they reported that Ma Xiaohong, a female business leader in Liaoning province in Dandong, the head of Hongxiang, she's the CEO of the Hongxiang firm, famously was taken off the board. She's a kind of an important chess piece in Chinese-North Korean trade, and she was criticized, removed from her post in Liaoning in 2016. And this was in a kind of China cracking down on cross-border trade. This is one of the big players. She's a big fish in North Korea. She's got a lot of networks with Donju there. And so there's the sense that China has moved in and has used anti-corruption as a pretext to remove her from Chinese North. Now RFA Korean has reported she may be back in the mix and working with North Korea. And it's the thing that these individuals, including those who have been charged with corruption, are still assets for the Chinese regime. And if they want to increase trade with North Korea, you bring those people back into the fold. So the impact of state widening trade, and this is very much what we see in China now, in Jilin and in the Dandong side, where they are talking about we've got to get the economy back up and running. It isn't just about tourism, it's about cross-border trade. And not manufacturing now. We may see more North Korean workers coming in because they want to get cross-border trade revived, anything they can do. Does that then create more toleration for illegal trade, right? So does the impetus to reinstate or to accelerate and reinvigorate trade between North Korea and China, does that leave more trade for illegality? It certainly, I think, leaves more room for local officials to be sensing which way the wind is moving, and this kind of the overall direction, or the mass line, as they think they used to call it, 中路线, right? The general line towards kind of, if the general line is toward cross-border trade, we can take more independent initiative. And of course, the whole history of North Korean-Chinese relations since 1949, you see a lot of kind of locality to locality interaction under the umbrella of a broad blessing from the ministries of foreign affairs. But the central government's important, but local government, these people have got to hit their targets. So there's this sense of kind of reinvigoration, and illegality can happen underneath that. Okay, so getting closer to some kind of provocative questions which might we might then discuss. Known unknowns. The impact of the recent floods in North Pyongan province, for example. I think there's a sense that border controls are very poor at the moment in that area because of this infrastructural damage. Clearly, the fences and things of that nature would have been wiped out by the flood. We've read a few reports that there's a kind of a sense that traders and illegal trade is going to be moving up the river, getting away from Dandong and Shinwiju. There is the GN Manpo interchange, which, again, as a historian, during the Korean War, that's much more important than Dandong. That's where all the Chinese troops moved into North Korea from. If you want, that's where in the past when North Korea got the gigantic trucks in for mobile missile launching. They probably came in on the train tracks there. May have come in on ships. But the GN Manpo interchange is always quieter. It's less watched. You don't have like Han Korea reporters kind of hanging around or Chosun Ilbo reporters generally watching that interchange. But what we've seen, at least in unofficial reports, things like the Daily NK, for example, is that this Linjiang Chunggang-gun, rather, in Jagangdo is probably one of the interchanges where we might see more action. I've been to that part of the border, not recently, of course, but the river is not terribly wide. It's the kind of upper Yalu, basically. There is one distinction that's kind of interesting, just from a slightly little bit of inside baseball, I guess, distinction. Linjiang and Chunggang County are, of course, you're at the edge of Jagangdo there. Whereas if you go a little further down the border towards the Hesan side, you're talking about Yanggangdo and the two counties of Kim Hyung-jik-gun and Kim Jong-suk-gun, named, of course, after the family members of the founder, Kim Il-sung. So again, that's a quieter area. There's less infrastructure. But if you're talking about small smuggling, small scale smuggling, you might see more action there. There's, of course, a history of logging kind of going across the border there. Automobiles moving back and forth, and so you can have some smaller scale stuff going across there. Although the bridges are fairly small, and I'm not sure about the Linjiao. It's Hesan and Changbai County where the bridges and the infrastructure is much more able to receive kind of large scale freight. The impact of perceived, let's see, state interaction I mentioned with anti-corruption and illegal trade, the impact of perceived, flows and changes in Sino-North Korean relations. Not a lot of time to get into that. If you want to do it in the Q&A, I'm happy to discuss it. There's been so much discussion about sort of North Korea and Russia, and has China gotten a little upset with seeing this kind of love fest, or at least this kind of, and also the Ukraine arms munitions. It's interesting to think about how that affects a place like Hunchun, which is so close to Russia as well. Happy to discuss kind of the broader trends in Sino-North Korean relations. But as I mentioned, I think the economic imperatives for PRC sometimes can trump even the political ones. So it's not like Xi Jinping and the local cadre. If you read those readouts of Liaoning Central Party Committee, Jilin Central Party Committee, Yanbian officials, Dandong mayors, Dandong vice party secretaries, of course, the discourse of border security is there, and crisis management and crisis prevention. And of course, China was not very involved at all in this in the flood response for North Korea. And I've got some studies ongoing of previous examples of that. But at the same time, I think all those people are being pressed. Expand the economy, get border trade moving if you can. And finally, I mentioned the disentangling of the cross-border legal trade, along with illegal trade in North Korea. And I think this is the difficult thing, is to try to get a sense of cross-border illegality with local illegality. So when China's doing a crackdown on heroin, for example, in Wangjing or in Hunchun or around Dandong, do we read that as this makes a permissive environment for trade, for illegal trade between North Korea? It's very hard to read it's very hard to read to what extent any of this is being exported or brought in. So all you can do is read as much data as possible about the public security situation on the Chinese side of the border, and then and about where, in which salient of the border this is happening, and we can then perhaps infer more about what the situation might be like for a North Korean. And I'll just end with these images I took in South Pyongan province in 2016. So these are rather dated, but I think most people's firsthand experience of being in North Korea, or those of us who have had the chance to be there, everybody's passport's getting a little bit dusty going to North Korea. So I hope to be back at some point in the near future. But these are some images I took in the last 8 years. And this is just a trip, as I mentioned, in South Pyongan, went to Pyeongseong. To this sort of sense of how easy is it to move around province to province, county to county. That's an open question, and probably a question for more scholars to approach. But I'll just put in one final plug for my paper on domain consensus, thinking about to what extent are local officials actually kind of involved in this and able to benefit from it. The many incentives on the North Korean side, amid the anti-corruption, amid the controls, are very similar to those on the Chinese side. That is all. Thank you very much. I'm ready to take some questions.
Yeah, and then my last question before you let you go is, let's be a little bit more hypothetical. I mean, we know the sanction is going to be there at least for a while, if not forever. And then sanctions lifted, and then the relationship between the North Korea and then the United States become better, and then South Korea also fine, and this border trade become legalized, and then they don't need to smuggle anymore. Then what's happened to this borderline political economy?
That's a brilliant question. I love it. I wish I had thought of that for my previous. That would be an amazing final chapter. And it might happen, right? There are many things that might move, right? I mean, you get suddenly North Korea is not, the Ukraine war ends, and so their Russian relationship is improved even further. They've got more help at the Security Council. And somehow, the Sino-North Korean relationship rebalances again. He and Xi Jinping kind of get back together. And the sanctions regime, I mean, we saw the UN panel of experts, right? Just whoosh, it's gone. I mean, amazing, right? The amount of research they were doing, those reports are you can read those for a whole year at a time, right? And so what if we have that kind of reconfiguring of trade? I guess the question is, do the small scale traders, are they able then to become legal, right? So we have to kind of look at questions of rule of law and management in North Korea and in China on both sides. This is the weird thing. We see this with the North Korean-U.S. negotiations. You remember the Trump era, of course, and where suddenly North Korea and China saying, "Wait a minute, this is, we need to feel in control here. We need to, you need to talk to us more as well." So we might have a hypothetical where the North actually want to open up the border more, and want to see, Kim Jong-un has that beautiful, architectures, right? He loves the young architects, or at one time he gave a lot of praise to the young architects in Pyongyang. He's got a lot of plans for Shinwiju. And it might say, I'm ready to go again. But of course, the North Koreans are notorious for doing that very quickly, as in the case of 2000, 2001, 2002, right, where they had sort of the new economic zone for Shinwiju and had not really spoken to the Chinese about it. Yang Bin being the famous example of a Chinese capitalist who is ready to dive in with both feet. The Chinese state said, I'm sorry, your taxes are not in order. So I think, anyway, the very short answer to your question would be, in that counterfactual, watch out for China pumping the brakes and saying, wait a minute, we need to make sure this is all in order. Although I think in the long term they would benefit too, certainly, from sanctions being released.
This is going to be pretty interesting, and of course, narcotics cannot be legalized in the the borderline, but I think other than that, it's going to be pretty interesting, and then I think it's pretty good for the China's northeast the part region, Dongbei, Sanxing, and then those North Korea, I mean entire North Korea. But again, the caveat is North Korean nuclear issue. I mean, this is going to be a really difficult the thing to remove before we become even more hypothetically imagining this normalized border in North Korea, and in China, and then probably in Russia and North Korea. Okay, yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for inviting me into those wonderful questions. I'll be thinking about those long term. Really appreciate it.